Welcome back to Movies TV Mad. You can follow me on X at Movies TV Mad and on Instagram, Movies TV Mad X. A happy new year to all my subscribers, followers on all platforms and anyone who's ever given me any support. In fact, if you ever hated me, a happy new year to you as well. I want this channel to go beyond DC and Doctor Who. Of course, we're going to be talking about DC and Doctor Who throughout the year, but I also want to review old movies and new movies. Basically, I want us to expand our entertainment palette. And today we're going to look back at James Cameron's Titanic, one of my favourite films of all time, and I watch it a hell of a lot. This is a controversial opinion, but I believe that Titanic is James Cameron's greatest achievement. Most people will say T2, Terminator 2, Judgment Day, a movie that I love and will be looking back at another time on another video. But today I want to talk about Titanic. Now, if you're old enough, you'll remember that Jim Cameron was under a hell of a lot of pressure when he was making this movie. Pundits didn't believe it was a good idea. You'd made T2, mate, The Abyss. Why are you making a film about Titanic? Well, Titanic was Jim Cameron's passion project. He was obsessed about the ship and the sinking. It's a very interesting film and an even more interesting subject matter. To make a great period piece, you've really got to convince your audience that they're outside of their comfort zone. That at a time where there was no protection for the poor, that, it was a very, we're talking about 1912 here. So it was a very different time. No social media, not that we had any social media when Titanic was released anyway, but we're talking about the modern world versus 1912. So you've got to take your audience and put them in a very different time. And he was able to do that. He took a very famous historical incident. Clearly, he had a lot of interest in it. Now, I believe he could have gone at this very, very differently. Instead of having the old lady remembering her love story with Leonardo DiCaprio, we could have kind of flashed forward and back to the trials. There were actually Titanic hearings to investigate who was to blame, what went wrong. For me, if you could have flashed from that to the actual Titanic, that would have been a more interesting movie. It wouldn't have been a movie that would have made as much money as the way Jim Cameron went at Titanic. He decided to go with the love story because that would sell the movie better. And he was right. It made a hell of a lot of money. It was successful. Nobody thought it was going to be successful, including me. I remember the posters of Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio over the Titanic ship, should I say. And I thought, are people going to go and watch this? Are general audiences going to be interested in this? And of course, people fell in love with the love story. The thing with the love story is you take the Titanic sinking, an incident, and make it a B plot, and you make the love story the A plot. But it works because it's a greatly formulated love story. It's written beautifully by Cameron, and Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio were brilliant. Their performances were outstanding. To this day, I'm shocked that the old lady playing the older Rose was the only one to win an Oscar. And, for me, Kate Winslet deserved better. Leonardo DiCaprio deserved better. If anyone deserved a supporting Oscar actor nod, maybe Kathy Bates, maybe even Victor Garber, who played the Irish designer of the Titanic. A brilliant performance from him. You know, Billy Zane was amazing in the movie. A lot of people don't like Billy's performance. I thought it was a brilliant performance. But what you see from the cast at the time, they wouldn't have been very expensive to pay. Leo wasn't that famous. He was an up-and-comer at the time. He'd done a lot of films already. What's Eating Gilbert Grape with Johnny Depp. Obviously, This Boy's Life as a young child with Robert De Niro. He'd done a lot already. He was very famous, and everybody knew this young actor was going places, but he wouldn't have been as expensive as he is now. Kate wouldn't have been expensive. Billy Zane wouldn't have been expensive. So it was an interesting cast. I mean, there was a guy who played Victor in The Young and the Restless, an American soap, a daytime soap. Clearly, maybe Jim Cameron was a fan of The Young and the Restless daytime American soap. Who knows? But beyond the love story and beyond the sinking of the Titanic, Jim Cameron really does have a lot of commentary about the class system back in 1912. We see the poor people on the ship treated like absolute shit. They're treated for life before they board, while, Billy Zane's character and Kate Winslet's character, Rose, are just allowed to go onto the ship and get treated like royalty. So there was huge commentary about the class system in this movie. It's something that critics and pundits never really spoke about. Because I've seen this film so many times, it's there, and that element is done very, very well. But there are kind of key moments that show you why the Titanic sank. There's the guy who came up with the idea for the ship. He's on the ship and he's pressuring the captain, who's, on his last kind of gig, if you like, to go faster, to break records. That's one of the key elements why they weren't able to turn away from the iceberg. So there's key elements like that. Because the building of the ship, Titanic, was a rich man's vanity project. And again, Cameron makes sure that we know that. So there's a lot of interesting commentary about the class system in Titanic. I think that Titanic is probably as close to the 90s ever got to Gone with the Wind. I think it's that huge a movie. You're talking about a 3-hour plus epic, and it really, really works. And I think it's a very interesting film, but he does pull off the love story. There's no question about that. And clearly the chemistry between DiCaprio and Winslet really works in this movie. And she's kind of promised to this rich guy, played by Billy Zane. But the interesting elements of this film as well are at the beginning with Bill Paxton's character. And I think this is very interesting. He plays this treasure hunter who's looking for, the heart of the ocean, this heavy diamond. He finds Rose's portrait that Jack, draws in the movie. And then she contacts him. It's a very, very interesting premise because Bill Paxton's character is nothing more than an opportunist treasure hunter who seems to know a lot about Titanic and Billy Zane's wealthy character, but doesn't seem to care about it, as we see him making that home video pretending he cares about Titanic because he's being funded by people. He's being accused of being a grave robber if you listen carefully at the beginning of the movie. So there is a very, very interesting character. And I love the guy who's working with Bill Paxton. That big bearded guy who doesn't trust old Rose, and he's very cynical and funny. And, so I really like him. I think there's a lot of great supporting characters and actors in this film. Something that goes, I suppose, unrealized by a lot of audiences and pundits on this film. And as I say, you've got people like Kathy Bates, who plays brilliant, plays Molly Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown, and she's begging them on the lifeboats to go back for the people. And that's a very interesting premise as well. The Welsh guy, the Welsh guy on the boat, he's the only one who wants to go back, and that's a great performance. He probably should have been nominated for an Oscar as well. It really is a great achievement. Because I think what Titanic is a rarity in film. And we're talking about the 20th century, not the 21st century, where it's a very groundbreaking, technically shot movie. And there's a lot of CGI in the movie. You don't notice it, but there's a hell of a lot of CGI in this movie. But technically, in the VFX are beautiful, but there's a story here at the same time. So it's a rarity in film to have such a beautifully shot technical film, because Jim Cameron is a very technical effects-based director, but he makes sure there's a story. And all the characterizations are great and interesting. Jack's friend, Fabrizio, the Italian kid, Bastardo. I loved him too. And there's, if you think about all those little characters, they had little, very mini stories of their own as well. But of course, the main centerpiece is Rose. Really, this film is about Rose and this young girl being promised to this wealthy guy because they've lost the father who had money. They're poor, but nobody knows they're poor, because being poor was terrible. I mean, being poor is a struggle for anyone even today, but back then, being poor was literally a death sentence. And we see the poor people on the lower kind of levels of the Titanic ship and how they're treated, how they're locked up like animals as the sinking begins. But yeah, I think there's lots of very, very interesting elements to this film. They mention historical figures like Freud and Picasso. Rose is very interested in art and painting, and she owns some of Picasso's pieces as well. And Billy Zane's character goes, Picasso, what kind of name is that? He'll never amount to anything. Now, at that moment, even on first viewing, that this character is a bit of a twat. But yeah, and obviously you get a bit of domestic violence here as well, as Billy Zane's character smacks Kate Winslet's character about. So that is what we call in the business justification. So what Cameron has to do is make Billy Zane's character unsympathetic. So when Rose meets Jack, falls in love with him and starts cheating on Billy Zane's character, we don't judge her too much. I mean, there's been this joke throughout the years that Jack could have got on the raft as well. I don't think he could have, by the way, but it's a funny joke because he does try and get on there and it starts to sink. So he sacrifices himself for Rose. In a way, the character of Jack is Rose's guardian angel. It's amazing that as we get to the third act of the film, this is a street kid. He knows what he's doing. He's roughed it. He's been ice fishing. So when the boat's capsizing, he knows they have to stay on it as long as possible. And I love that. Leonardo DiCaprio is so utterly convincing as this street kid, Jack. Very likable, very fascinating. And Rose is the other end of the spectrum, who comes from the kind of high level of society. In a lot of ways, he's taken the Aladdin love story from the animated Disney movie Aladdin, where you've got this kind of princess. She's not a princess, but she's not happy with being a princess. And then you've got this guy who's homeless, who's basically a vagrant who works from place to place, who wishes he was a bit more. But he's happy with his lot in life. It's very Aladdin kind and Jasmine love story-ish, if you think about it. And I think that was an element that really, I suppose, kind of made the audience like the love story. And there's still today so many shippers for Jack and Rose. It's a tragic love story because Jack dies and they can't live a life together. Because Jack's there to uplift Rose, to show her a better way. He stops her from killing herself. He, as the old Rose says, Jack saved my life in every way a person can save another person's life. So I suppose Rose is many of us in the world today, suffering with anxiety and depression and unhappy with her lot in life. And then this guy comes from nowhere and he really does save her in every way. So the love story really, really works. And I think the love story is the key element of the film. That's why it's successful. Whether the love story should have been there is a debate that many people and pundits have been having for many, many years. As I said earlier, the love story becomes the A plot and the Titanic sinking becomes the B plot. But it works. And, in the last hour of the film, it really is about the Titanic sinking and the tragedy. But it really is fascinating watching this film and watching 1912 era people with their mentalities and, the kind of lives that they're leading. I always find period pieces fascinating because we live in the era of technology, luxury, big tellies, like watching Titanic today is even more kind of humbling when you think about the devices we have, the way we live our lives, the way we bitch and moan on social media about every single thing. You think about a character like Jack and what he went through. If you listen to what he said to Rose when they first meet, he explains that he was orphaned at the age of 15, that he had no brothers or sisters. As he put it, he had no kin. So he's travelling about on his own because he's got no choice, and he's using his talent, which is his artistic talent, to survive, and he gets used to it. And when Rose's mother tries to put his little route for existence down, he says, I love travelling from place to place, not knowing who I'm going to meet, from day to day, not knowing what my life's going to be. And I think that's the point. He's a very fascinating character because he's not working class. He's lower than working class. This is a homeless kid just surviving who falls in love, as I say, basically with the analogy of a princess. And, he's content to die and let her live. And it's a very thought-provoking moment. And he says to her, when she's on the raft and he's freezing in the water, you've got to do me this honour. You've got to promise me you survive and you go on. Because otherwise, the angel's sacrifice is pointless. And this is what Leonardo DiCaprio's character in this film is. But Titanic would have been a very hard film to make because Jim Cameron, as I said earlier, was under a lot of pressure. No one understood the sanity of a man who wanted to make an expensive, this was not a cheap film, one of the most expensive films ever about the Titanic sinking. Nobody believed it was an interesting film to make. Nobody. Not me, not other people. Nobody understood why the bloke who had made classics like T2 was wasting his time on this. A lot of people were angry with Jim. Why aren't you making more Terminator movies? Why are you doing this? And Jim never really went back to Terminator. I know he was involved with the latter ones, like as a producer or something, but he's never been interested to write and direct a Terminator movie. I mean, it would be interesting if he went back because whatever he touches turns to gold. Maybe he should leave it at T2, but we'll see. But yeah, he was under a lot of pressure, and there was this kind of bad blood between him and Kate Winslet because Kate Winslet was in the pool of cold water and she wanted a break and he wouldn't allow it. But you got to remember the pressure he was under. Kate Winslet being in cold water wasn't the biggest of his problems. And when you're a director, you've got everyone at you. You got everyone, actors, everyone who works on the movie coming to you. Where should I go? What should I do? Are you sure you want me to do this? Questioning you as well. And there would have been a lot of people questioning Jim Cameron. But oh boy, did Jim prove everyone wrong about this movie. As I say, I think it's his best piece of work. Better than Terminator 2. Better than The Abyss. Better than both Avatar films. Because this film is really telling a story, a fictional story, based on a real historical incident. And he really does go deep with it. And, looking at the class system and really blaming the class system for the Titanic crash. Because what you've got to understand is, Titanic was big news at the time in 1912. When they built this ship, it was huge. Things like that didn't happen. Mostly they would get on ships to go from place to place. Were there even aeroplanes in 1912? I'm not sure. But yeah, it was one of the main modes of, traveling from place to place. So building this ship was very, very, very groundbreaking. But a vanity project for the wealthy. They called it the unsinkable ship. So that's, I love great irony. One of the great ironies of this historical incident, Titanic, that they called a ship unsinkable, but it was certainly sinkable because of their own arrogance, because of the speed the ship was going at. Because at the end of the day, how can you have an unsinkable ship? And once you start calling a ship unsinkable, of course, you are looking for trouble. But this film has one of my favourite scores. This score is absolutely beautiful. And the song by Celine Dion was magic. It was the era in the 90s of the movie song. Whether it was Bryan Adams, Everything I Do It For You, Whitney Houston, I Will Always Love You from the Bodyguard movie, or Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On. These were number one. And I think some of them even won Oscars. I think Celine's My Heart Will Go On song actually did win an Oscar. So Titanic won with the box office and with, the critics. Everyone loved this film. The pundits thought it was amazing. It really shocked the world because nobody, and I mean nobody, believed in this movie. But when I was reading the media, kind of willing it to fail, I kind of started rooting for it before I saw it because I love an underdog. And when these assholes, these arrogant assholes start saying something's not going to work, I love it when it does. It's like Snyder's Rebel Moon. They all wanted it to fail, number one all over the world on Netflix. It really pisses them off when someone doesn't do what, they want them to. And the point is, nobody wanted Jim Cameron to make a movie about Titanic. They just wanted another Terminator movie. But he had finished his Terminator story. That's the point. And Titanic was his passion project. For me, I think Titanic is a very, very important movie. And I'll tell you why. Because I think historically, it's an important story to tell. All of us grew up with hearing about the Mary Rose sinking and the Titanic sinking, but we didn't know much more about it than that. So I think it was great for young men and women like myself at the time to learn kind of what happened. And when I see these films, like when I saw Oliver Stone's JFK, I automatically started researching the John F. Kennedy assassination. Now, I wanted to know more about Titanic, so that's why I know there was proper hearings to investigate what happened. If I made a Titanic movie, I'd be focusing on those hearings a hell of a lot. As I said earlier, I'd be flashing forward and back from the hearings to the actual Titanic incident. I think that will be really interesting. Maybe Jim Cameron's not too old to make another Titanic movie. I doubt it. I know he wouldn't do that. And there was nonsense spoken about a Titanic too. But it would be fucking ridiculous. You can't make a sequel about Titanic. I mean, what you could have done, of course, you could have, done an older Rose and see what she did. I mean, Kate Winslet at the age, but you know, who would want to see that film anyway? Titanic is a classic movie. I'd love to know in the comments down below what you think about this movie. This movie reflects around attempted suicide, the class system, and love, and what it means. Because at the end of the day, Jack and Rose didn't have a long time together, but was it worth it? Was it worth going on the ship and feeling that love, even though it was short-lived? Was it worth suffering that? And imagine being on that fucking ship and either dying, which is bad, but imagine surviving that, having that survivor's guilt, being in that cold water. One of the things I think Cameron does so well, and his actors, you really see how fucking cold the North Atlantic must have been. And you know, there would have been people suffering with hypothermia afterwards. But yeah, I think the realism of the film, that's what I love about the film. The realism of the 1912 kind of era, the realism that you can tell that this is really cold water and it's your enemy and it could kill you. Because don't forget, that's why there's a fucking iceberg there in the first place, because it's so cold. And that's another interesting element. They didn't really have a detecting system, really, back then, because it was 1912 to detect bergs. All they had was a couple of blokes with kind of, was that a little phone? They even had phones. Kind of, did you notice how they were able to phone through to each other on the actual ship? So it was a groundbreaking ship, you know, amazing, really. I mean, let's not get it twisted. The idea of the Titanic, when you think about that ship was amazing. It was grand. And if it didn't hit an iceberg, it would have been fine. But it did, because it was going too fast. Because the moral of the Titanic sinking, but especially the moral of the actual story, is vanity and arrogance. Let's go faster. Let's get there early, right? That's the problem. And that's why that ship sunk. And that's the story also that Cameron was attempting to tell. So James Cameron really makes a film on the basis in the way the older films used to be made in the 40s and 50s. Because if you go back to the 40s and 50s war movies and movies like that, they're all based around the love story. Very, very interesting. Because these days, because we've got progressives making entertainment, they don't really like love stories. Because, you know, a movie's got to be more than about the love story. It's like, you know, in a way, Oppenheimer in the 90s would have been set around Kate and Leo falling in love. So it's very, very different. It's, you know, the mentality is different today. So Jim Cameron made really an old-fashioned movie on the parameters in the way old-fashioned movies used to be made. For me, this is a historical classic movie. I mean, don't forget this film was released in 1997. So this is a pretty old movie to today's standards, but nothing can compete with films like Titanic, Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump's also a film I really, really want to review on this channel because I think it's a perfect movie. I really do. Again, it's not about action. I mean, there is VFX and CGI in that movie, but it's about the character of Forrest Gump. A simple man, obviously a bit slow, with learning difficulties. In fact, he could be me, you know, but you see what he achieves. And what that movie says as well is, you can be slow, you may not have very much, but as long as you've got heart, you can have a good life, you can fall in love, and you can achieve anything. We'll get into the Forrest Gump movie at another time. But I think the 90s was a very special time for film, and it all started with Ghost, another film we can review on this channel, as unfortunately they've announced they're going to do a Ghost reboot, so it can be a little bit more progressive than the first one was. What a load of bullshit. When modern day art is so bad, mid, and uninteresting, we basically go back to what we loved. And this is what I've done with today's review of Titanic.